20 years ago, almost this month, how many of you were at the Ideas Fair? I don't spend much time in Vancouver these days. It's more interesting being elsewhere in the world and doing some comparisons. However, thought it was useful to relook at CityPlan. Some things we did well, some things we didn't, and Andy's really interested in hearing from you what worked and what didn't work. Okay, one of the things Andy asked me was getting a bit more background as to why we did CityPlan. This was what was happening in City Hall at the time. And as you may recall, in 1992, Vancouver's plan was about 30 years old. We had done a lot of new development in the downtown, so the new central area plan was basically in place. But it was starting to run into some challenges. And one of those challenges was that as residential development was happening through False Creek, Cole Harbour, it was starting to push into the industrial areas. And council was starting to say, back behind the scenes at City Hall, council was starting to say, do we continue to get rid of all the industrial land, mostly the services close to downtown? So that was one of the big questions that was circulating around City Hall. The second observation was, if we're not going to continue to redevelop industrial land, then where do we develop? And so that development question was one of the key issues for council at the time. And for those of you who were here in '92, single family meant single family, other than 30,000 illegal suites. And while sustainability wasn't being talked about in that word, council was very concerned about the question of having very low density areas with people having to commute and not taking advantages of services that were already in place. But every time council tried to do something, adding more housing in the neighborhoods, more choice of housing, what of course happened? People, quite rightly, because they haven't been consulted, saying, why is this happening in my neighborhood? Now, there wasn't new housing happening in the sense of multiple housing, but for any of you who are around, there was certainly a lot of change happening as large houses replaced small houses. And a lot of changing demand as we were increasingly seeing areas that were built for more sort of the traditional nuclear family, finding not only were we getting a lot of extended families, but a lot of the original folks were aging. So changing demand for services. And then in 1992, the federal and provincial governments cut almost $30 million out of the city budget. So suddenly council not only had challenges about where growth might happen, it also had challenges about how are we going to provide services to people. So those were the discussions that were going on in City Hall at the time. The sort of tipping point came when council and staff said, we've got this great idea. We'll put new development on a few scattered industrial sites like the Arbutus lands. And the moment the proposal for the Arbutus lands came out, the community said, why weren't we involved? Council, basically, every sort of storm is a perfect opportunity for something to happen. And council then said, all right, we've had it. Let's invite the public to walk in our shoes, our meeting council shoes. Now, council, in doing that, council asked staff to come up with a planning process. And I must admit, we came up with something very typical of the times, where staff would do a draft plan and we'd take it out. And council said, look, that's not going to help. We're still going to have the public saying, why weren't we involved? And interestingly, I hate to say this, Andy, but in Melbourne, Sydney, and Auckland, where I've been in the last couple of months, they've still got this process happening to the extent that the staff do the first draft plan. Council said, no way. They wanted to hear about all issues, not just land use. Council wanted to hear from new people, And council wanted to hear through new ways. And council basically told staff, go away and invent a process, which starts with people being involved from step one. And I think that was one of the biggest differences that, and I'll leave this for you to look at, but the best place to look for different levels of involvement is on the IAP2 website, and we weren't empowering, council wanted to collaborate with the community in developing a new plan. 4-step process. First step, inviting people to get together and join city circles. How many were involved in a city circle? A couple people. Hey, you missed a wonderful opportunity. City circles, each with their toolkit, were groups of about 10 to 15 people who got together, and the only requirement council put on the city circles was that if you had an idea for the future of Vancouver, not only should you share your idea, you should share how to do it. So ideas and solutions were expected to travel together. The other thing council said to staff, so if your group of staff's in here, council said, and we don't want you, staff, pushing the process or saying what's good and what's bad for the city. So in a sense, the public discussion was unfettered. It was very broad, cost quite a bit, but there was translation into 6 different languages. Large number of people came out. We thought we'd get 25 city circles. We had about 370 of which worked in languages other than English, and there was about 150 circles in classroom circles. The idea was that everybody got their circles, got their presentations, went into an ideas book, and then artists helped circles display the various ideas, because somehow we had to share it. I'm just running through a few of these because it's interesting. Some of them are land use, some of them are housing, and this one was about youth crashing. A lot of different topics. It wasn't your traditional land use plan. Now, did anyone happen to be part of Themes Day? Themes Day, staff carefully went through the 3,000 submissions, had 1,500 sort of separate ideas or directions or thoughts for Vancouver, each one on a little card. And if you'd been a citizen coming to Ideas Day, you would have got a whole stack of cards, and you had to try and sort the cards to organize the different ideas so that when they were discussed at an ideas fair, people had some organization to all the ideas that had come out. And at the ideas fair, your thing doesn't click as fast as mine does. The ideas fair had a lot of opportunities for people to talk about their ideas, share ideas, and one of the things that there was a lot of involvement with youth, which actually brought adults into the process. Rather younger mayor, but just so you know, it was actually Gordon who came up with the idea of city circles. Lots of people displaying some of their ideas for the future of the city, and the purpose of the fair was for people to talk to each other, to look at some of the ideas, and then fill in what we called a checkbook to say which ideas should the city pursue further and which ones really, were non-starters. About 10,000 people came to the Ideas Fair over 3 days. It was a wonderful buzz. And there was a lot of actual very positive support that the city was actually reaching out to people. At the end of the Ideas Fair, there were a few ideas that were so broadly supported, like greenways, that council just went ahead and said, we're not going to wait for the rest of the process. Let's fund this. Let's start having people talk about actual greenways. But there were a lot of areas where there was no real agreement, and so council did a workbook. City circles got back together, lots of different topics. The key ones that people were really concerned about was certainly where people would live, whether we would continue to sprawl out in the greenfields areas, whether we would take industrial land or look at intensifying some of these single-family areas. Another key issue, because council was worried about where to get money from, was did we reduce services, did we increase taxes, or did we simply take the existing services and reallocate the money, which is actually what happened at the end of the day. The workbook was great. It did give a lot of key directions for the city after the circles had filled it in and discussed the ideas. But there was one key issue: what was going to happen in single-family neighborhoods where there was still no agreement. So council invited people who have been part of circles to come up with some displays, looking again at some of the different options for the neighborhoods. The displays toured the city. A number of people are nodding, so you probably came to the Futures tent. Never run a summer program unless it's at a tent on the beach, which has great support. People then commented about what they thought should be the key directions. Council reviewed what had come out of the public process and approved CityPlan. So that was CityPlan. Took about 20 months of actual work over 2.5 years. And I think the more interesting thing was that some of the surveys later suggested about 40% of the households in the city actually participated in some way. That's over 100,000 people. Now, with that in place, council was then able to write the regional context statement responding to the regional plan and make some decisions. The question about what's going to happen in the single-family areas, it fascinated me that at the end of the day, about 82% of the participants thought that redevelopment should happen in single-family areas. There's a caveat here, with the vast majority thinking it should happen in neighborhood centers, but particularly the southeast part of the city, thinking infill was really the way they wanted to go. And in case you're wondering, was it all people downtown or outside the city who voted? The vast majority of people who participated in CityPlan actually lived in the RS neighborhoods. At the end of the day, council approved the notion of taking more choice of housing in neighborhoods, provided that new growth was provided with new services. So it was a balance of new growth and new services. A lot of issues around funding were settled, with agreeing that developers would pay development cost contributions. And I think one of the more interesting things in some ways is when people are active, you'd think they'd really be voting for a lot more neighborhood decision making. But interestingly, out of this process, about a third of the people liked the existing government system, about a third wanted more consultation, and about a third wanted actual decision making to the communities. So an overwhelming, which was kind of interesting. This was only a general plan, and what happened over the next few years, and this is where many of you are probably more involved in the actual community visions. How many were actually involved in community visions? Pretty well everybody. So this is where you kind of came to the party, and I think this is partly what Andy's looking at, because community visions was where we actually landed the plan on the ground. And after CityPlan was done, there was two sets of work going on. One was doing a whole lot of city-wide plans for industry, for financing growth, for culture. The other was going into the neighborhoods. And so this is where you can talk to Andy. But there is a question, how did we actually, I want to talk about how people were involved. This is where a good example was, so we're going to go into neighborhoods, and what did the city do? Staff didn't go away and determine which neighborhoods in what order. Rather, we had a workshop, and people recommended criteria for choosing neighborhoods, and recommended which neighborhoods first. And on the east side, Cedar Cottage was the number one. Anybody at this workshop? So people were actually, advising each other on what the, and out of that also came a terms of reference as to what roles different stakeholders would have in the process. So we have CityPlan, grounding visions. We had a 18-month process, and we had a rezoning policy, as you all know, during the time, so that we weren't going to get rezoning in the neighborhoods while the visions were underway. Had advisory committees, which were very helpful. And as I talked to other people in other parts of the world, I think Was anyone on a City Perspectives panel at any time? That is something other people are very interested in. It wasn't staff or council saying, you know, you've got to change your plan. It was citizens talking to citizens. A lot of discussion around what happens as the population ages, what kind of housing and where. A lot of discussion about what services in the neighborhoods. Then we probably were all involved in surveys. What amazed us, and we hadn't planned this as staff, was at the end of the process of doing community visions, about 70 resident committees actually formed that had nothing to do with City Hall. It was just people wanting to help themselves in their neighborhoods. Lots of different activities going on. New visions by 2006 when I left the city. The last one, West Point Grey, was just underway, almost completed. Out of that, as you know, came the neighborhood centers, and the first neighborhood center in Knighton Kingsway. And how many of you were a part of the Knighton Kingsway?
That was my neighbor. That is my neighborhood.
That is your neighborhood. I'm glad it is rather than was.
No, 30 years now.
Yeah. And so, as you know, the neighborhood center program was supposed to go neighborhood by neighborhood, and not only indicating what services, how to upgrade the particular shopping areas in the neighborhood, but also what kinds of housing, how they were going to fit into the neighborhood, what kind of services, and in the end, council approved the various kinds of housing and service priorities in Knighton Kingsway area. The development cost levies for the whole city kicked in at this time, and it was interesting. I was noticing that last year the development cost contributions came to about $145 million. So you start light, you start with a few, and now citywide there's a considerable amount of money coming in to try and balance new development with them. So I often say to people, what we really saw was people moving from enraged to engaged in the process, and that's what Andy would like to talk to you about. We certainly, people elsewhere in the world ask, how did we involve people? What kind of new processes? What works for participation? And a number of things work, but if I say one thing that really works, it has to be political leadership. If your council is willing to lead, is willing to listen, and then approve, but having listened in the process, then it works. If it's just a, you know, well, we'll hear, but we don't, then clearly it doesn't work. Trust is very fragile, as you all know. I think this is something Andy will be interested in. Certainly after I left the city, the mayor's office came up with eco-density. And my impression from the sidelines, because I purposefully not wanted to sit on the following director of planning's back and look over their shoulder, nothing's worse than having an ex-director go, what appears happened, and I'd be interested in whether you think this happened, but my impression was when the mayor came out, or someone came out with his eco-density, it struck me that a lot of people who had been very actively involved, putting hours of time in, said, look, if the mayor's got his plan, why am I wasting my time? And a lot of people who have been really involved and dedicated, my impression was, sort of left and went on to live their life. So I'll be interested in whether that was your impression. And certainly the fragile trust that happened, it's unfortunate that Norquay finally got through, but I'm not sure that any of the remaining neighborhood centers are happening. And it's sort of disappointing 20 years later to notice that. And I'll just leave this one for you to read, but and I think all of you are here because you believe that the public can engage. But Thomas Jefferson years ago said, people don't have the knowledge to engage in policy decisions, then the answer isn't to take it from them. The answer is to inform their discretion. And I know that when I look now, because I'm still teaching at university, things like crowdsourcing and that, this is actually an early form of non-computer internet crowdsourcing. We're going out to the broad public and saying, what do you think? And then, and I make this point elsewhere in the world, there were some tough choices made. It wasn't a plan where at the end of the day, we want to have lovely neighborhoods and we're going to let no change happen and change happen. And a lot of plans elsewhere in the world are kind of like that. This one made some tough choices, kept some of the industrial lands, and stopped sprawl, or said we're not going to encourage more sprawl out of the valley. We will take change in neighborhoods, but we'll do it in our own terms with services balancing the development. And that, I think, is one of the critical things when I look elsewhere in the world. It was the engagement from the start, and it was the actual engagement of people like yourselves in choicing, in advising council on some of those tough decisions that council needs to make. I'll conclude by saying the lucky thing that we have, you don't realize it until you leave elsewhere, is that most other places, and I would say this of Sydney, of Auckland, most elsewhere I'm working in the world, is that when council makes a decision, this happens in Ontario, and if you don't like it, you appeal it to the province, B. Here, when a council makes a decision, it is a decision, and if you don't like it, then you go to the election box next time. Most of the other cities where I'm working, the decisions are actually made by the province, or the equivalent of the province, or by, in New Zealand, the national government. So we're very far removed from the actual decision makers. And that, I think, is one of the key things we have in Vancouver that we don't really understand how lucky. You may be lucky, you may not be lucky, but I would say it's lucky, or at least it's close at hand. You're not having to argue with people in Ottawa about whether or not development should occur, which is the case in New Zealand. Okay, so that's just a general background on city plans.